Snow swept across the Alsatian plains like a ghostly tide, coating the shattered villages and frozen vineyards of eastern France. It was January 1945, Europe's deadliest winter, and while the world's eyes were fixed on the Ardennes, another brutal struggle was unfolding far to the south. The Germans called it Operation Nordwind, their last major offensive on the Western Front. To the exhausted soldiers of the U.S. 7th Army, it felt like the war had risen from its grave for one final, merciless round. The village of Hatten lay quiet beneath a blanket of snow, its church steeple cracked from artillery fire, its streets littered with burned-out half-tracks and collapsed barns. The 242nd Infantry Regiment of the 42nd Rainbow Division had only just arrived to hold this sector. Many of them were fresh replacements, teachers, farmers, factory workers, unprepared for the storm that was coming. And among them stood a man no one expected to become a legend, Staff Sergeant Vito R. Bertoldo. At first glance, there was nothing heroic about him. 30 years old, slightly built, quiet, with a patient stare that came from a hard life in Decatur, Illinois. Before the war, he'd been a coal miner and a furniture worker. Rejected from combat training because of poor eyesight, he had volunteered to serve as a cook. But fate, or perhaps stubborn defiance, placed him at the front. When the Germans struck, he was assigned to defend the battalion command post near the town of Hatten, a job that sounded unremarkable, almost safe. But nothing in Alsace was safe that winter. The enemy was coming with tigers and panthers, veteran SS troops, and the bitter resolve of men who refused to surrender. Their orders were clear: push the Americans out of Alsace, divide their lines, and reach Strasbourg before reinforcements could arrive. If Nordwind succeeded, the war in the West could be prolonged by months, maybe more. Inside the command post, a half-ruined farmhouse, Bertoldo stacked ammunition boxes near the windows and checked his Browning machine gun. Outside, snow hissed against the broken shutters. Somewhere beyond the fields, the rumble of engines rolled closer. Most men would have prayed for relief. Bertoldo only adjusted his helmet strap. "If they come," he muttered to no one in particular, "they'll have to come through me first." He didn't know it yet, but in the next 48 hours, that promise would turn him into one of the most unlikely heroes of the entire war. The first warning came in the form of silence. Just after dawn on January 9, 1945, the steady hum of artillery in the distance faded away, replaced by an uneasy stillness that crept across the fields of Alsace. Then, from beyond the fog, came the low, thunderous growl of engines, German tanks moving through the mist like predators hunting their prey. In the small town of Hatten, American lookouts strained to see through the snowfall. Shadows shifted among the ruins of barns and orchards, and moments later, the first shells began to fall. The ground shook, windows shattered, and the white snow turned to black dust. Operation Nordwind had begun in earnest. The German plan was audacious. A two-pronged assault meant to crush the thinly stretched American lines between the Rhine and the Vosges. Hitler had ordered the attack himself, believing one more offensive might break Allied morale after the failure in the Ardennes. Facing them were units of the U.S. 7th Army, already weakened, under-equipped, and exhausted after weeks of nonstop fighting. Inside the battalion command post on the edge of Hatten, chaos reigned. Radio operators shouted into static-filled headsets. Medics rushed to treat the wounded, and officers scrambled to find out who was still alive. Through the din, Staff Sergeant Vito Bertoldo manned a Browning .30 caliber machine gun at a shattered window. Outside, the first German infantry appeared, gray silhouettes darting through the fog, moving with deadly precision. The air filled with the sharp, mechanical chatter of machine guns. Bertoldo opened fire, his bursts tearing through the haze, dropping men where they stood. He reloaded without looking, steady and methodical. When his belt jammed, he cursed softly, cleared it, and fired again. Within minutes, the narrow street before the command post was littered with bodies and debris. Shells slammed into nearby buildings. The floor shook, dust rained down from the ceiling, but Bertoldo didn't move from his post. "Stay inside," he shouted to the medics. "I'll keep them off you." Outside, German troops regrouped, bringing forward a half-track with a mounted gun. Bertoldo waited until it was in range, then squeezed the trigger. Tracers arced through the snowstorm, finding their mark. The vehicle erupted in flames. For nearly an hour, He held the position alone, covering the command post as the rest of the company tried to organize a retreat. Each time the Germans tried to advance, he broke their momentum with relentless fire. By the time the attack paused, the ground was strewn with enemy dead. Bertoldo's machine gun barrel glowed dull red, smoke curling upward like a warning. The men inside looked at him in silence, astonished. The German offensive had only just begun, but on this frozen corner of Alsace, one man had already turned the tide of the morning. When the shelling finally stopped, the air inside the command post was thick with dust and the stench of gunpowder. The farmhouse that served as battalion headquarters was barely standing, walls cracked, roofs sagging, windows blown out. Yet somehow, it was still there. And so was Staff Sergeant Vito Bertoldo. He wiped the grime from his face and took a quick look outside. The snow was red and gray, churned up by tank treads and footsteps. In the distance, he could hear the rumble of engines again. The Germans were regrouping. They would come back, stronger, angrier, and better prepared. Bertoldo knew what he had to do. There was no time to wait for reinforcements or orders. He began transforming the shattered farmhouse into a fortress. He dragged overturned tables and doors to reinforce the windows. He stacked ammunition belts within arm's reach and positioned grenades along the sill. In the kitchen, he found a sandbag torn open by shrapnel and used it to seal a gap in the wall. "Get everyone out who doesn't need to be here," he told the officers. "If this post falls, the line goes with it." A lieutenant hesitated. "You can't hold this place alone, Sergeant." Bertoldo gave a faint smile. "I won't be alone. I've got plenty of ammo." Outside, snow began to fall again, muffling the distant sounds of movement. Through the shattered window, Bertoldo saw flickers of light, the reflection of German optics, perhaps, or the flash of a cigarette. He tightened his grip on the Browning and steadied his breathing. When the next attack came, it came hard. German infantry advanced under the cover of mortars, flanking through the ruins. The farmhouse shook with every impact. Inside, Bertoldo moved from one firing point to another, his machine gun spitting fire through the smoke. He fought with the calm precision of a craftsman. When the barrel overheated, he swapped it out. When a grenade landed nearby, he kicked it back through the window before it exploded. His eyes burned from the smoke, but he never flinched. Hours passed like minutes. The Germans tried to breach the door twice and were driven back each time. At one point, a shell blasted a hole through the wall, showering him with bricks. He stood up, wiped the blood from his forehead, and kept firing. By nightfall, the farmhouse was a ruin, but it was still American-held ground. And Vito Bertoldo, the former cook from Illinois, was the reason why. Night came early that January day, falling heavy over Hatten like a burial shroud. The sun had barely touched the horizon before the battlefield disappeared into a blue-gray haze, pierced only by the flicker of burning vehicles. Snow drifted down silently, settling on twisted metal and broken bodies. The air was so cold it bit into the lungs. Inside what was left of the farmhouse, Staff Sergeant Vito R. Bertoldo crouched near his Browning machine gun, feeding a fresh belt of ammunition into the smoking weapon. His hands were blistered, his uniform torn and stiff with frozen sweat. Every few minutes, he rubbed his fingers to keep the blood flowing. The radio was dead. The telephone lines had been cut hours ago. Whatever remained of the battalion command was scattered or destroyed. Bertoldo was alone now, alone in a house surrounded by enemy troops. Outside, he could hear the Germans moving. They spoke in low voices, their words muffled by the snow. From time to time, a flare arced into the sky, casting a ghostly light over the village. For an instant, the world turned white, and he could see them, silhouettes crawling between the ruins, rifles glinting in the flare light. Then darkness again. Bertoldo waited until they were close enough to hear their boots crunching on the snow. Then he opened fire. The Browning roared, its tracers streaking through the night like comets. Screams echoed from the street. He shifted aim, sweeping the weapon across the open ground, cutting down the next group before they could reach the walls. For a while, the Germans fell back, dragging their wounded with them. Bertoldo took the moment to reload and move to another firing point. He knew they would try again, probably with tanks this time. He could already hear the distant rumble of engines. At one point, a shell exploded so close it blew out the remaining door. Shards of glass and would rain down on him. A splinter tore through his sleeve and grazed his arm. He barely noticed. He was too focused, too determined. He found a moment to laugh, a short, rough sound that surprised even him. "Not tonight," he muttered. "You're not getting through tonight." Above the wrecked town, German flares continued to rise and fall, lighting the smoke in eerie pulses of orange and white. Somewhere beyond the horizon, other battles raged, other men fought and died. But here, in this ruined farmhouse in Alsace, one man was holding back an entire enemy assault through sheer willpower. And the night was only beginning. The sound came first, a deep metallic growl that rattled the broken window frames and made the floor tremble. Staff Sergeant Vito Bertoldo froze for a moment, listening. Then he knew. Tanks. The Germans were bringing armor into Hatten. Through the smoke and snow, faint lights flickered, headlamps covered by narrow slits. The rumble grew louder. Then he saw them. 2 Panthers, heavy silhouettes rolling down the main street, their turrets swinging like predators searching for prey. Infantry followed behind, using the tanks as moving shields. Bertoldo knew his machine gun couldn't stop armor, but he also knew he could stop the men. He took aim at the infantry and opened fire, the gun spitting fire into the night. The tracers slammed into the column, cutting down soldiers in the open. The tanks halted, their commanders ducking into their turrets. The element of surprise was gone. A shell whistled overhead and exploded against the far wall. The entire farmhouse shook. Dust filled the air. Another round hit closer, tearing away a section of the roof. The next would likely kill him. But Bertoldo didn't move. He dragged the Browning to a new window, rested the barrel on a pile of bricks, and kept firing. One Panther rolled forward, its cannon lowering. The muzzle flash lit up the night as it fired point blank. The shell blasted through the front wall, hurling debris across the room. For a few seconds, everything went silent except the ringing in Bertoldo's ears. Then, through the smoke, came the sound of boots, German troops rushing in to finish the job. Bertoldo grabbed a grenade, pulled the pin, and waited. When the first figure appeared in the doorway, he tossed it. The explosion blew the soldier backward, shattering what was left of the doorframe. He followed with a burst from the Browning, driving the survivors out into the snow. His position was half destroyed now, but still defensible. He shifted to the rear room, where he had set up a spare light machine gun earlier, just in case. He continued to fire, forcing the tanks to keep their distance. Every time they tried to approach, he aimed at the infantry and made them pay for every step. At one point, a German officer shouted something in English, an offer to surrender, maybe. Bertoldo only laughed, the sound echoing through the ruins. "Come take it," he shouted back. "If you can." Hours later, when the tanks finally pulled back to regroup, the farmhouse was a smoking skeleton. But it still stood. And inside, covered in dust and blood, Bertoldo was still alive, still defiant. The Germans had brought fire and steel, but they hadn't broken the man behind the gun. The hours bled together, indistinguishable from the bursts of gunfire and the pounding of shells. Time no longer had meaning in the ruined farmhouse of Hatten. Only survival did. Staff Sergeant Vito R. Bertoldo had been fighting for more than 12 hours straight. His hands were blistered raw, his shoulders ached from the recoil, and his eyes burned from smoke and exhaustion. The night outside had become an inferno. Burning tanks lit the snow in hues of orange and crimson. The smell of cordite and scorched metal hung heavy in the air. Occasionally, flares rose into the sky, revealing scenes of devastation. The wrecks of half-tracks, fallen soldiers frozen mid-stride, shattered houses glowing like dying embers. Bertoldo crouched beside the Browning, reloading with trembling hands. Every time he thought the attack had ended, the Germans came again, probing, testing, surrounding. They wanted the command post at any cost. They knew the man inside was still firing, still killing their men. He had become a thorn in their advance, a ghost they couldn't seem to silence. At around 2 a.m., a mortar shell exploded just outside the wall, sending fragments through the window. One shard tore across Bertoldo's shoulder, spinning him to the ground. The pain was immediate and sharp, but there was no time to think about it. He tore a strip from his sleeve, tied it around the wound, and dragged himself back to the gun. The next wave came minutes later. Infantry supported by a self-propelled gun firing point-blank into the building. The concussion from each hit knocked plaster from the ceiling and threw him against the wall. Yet somehow he kept firing. At one point, his ammunition ran dangerously low. He crawled through the debris to an adjoining room where extra belts were stored. When he returned, he found the barrel of the Browning warped from the heat. He replaced it, checked the chamber, and smiled grimly. "Still good," he muttered. The Germans tried a flanking maneuver through the back alley. Bertoldo caught them in the open with a burst from his secondary gun, mowing them down before they reached the door. Smoke filled the room, stinging his eyes, but he refused to yield an inch. By dawn, he was running on sheer willpower. His body was broken, his uniform scorched, his world reduced to the rhythmic hammering of the gun and the dull thunder of explosions. When the first light touched the snow outside, the battlefield lay silent. The enemy had withdrawn again, leaving behind dozens of dead. Bertoldo sat against the wall, bleeding and shaking, but alive. He looked at his blackened hands and let out a long breath. He had survived the longest night of his life, and the fight was far from over. The first light of dawn crept across the snow, pale and cold, revealing the full scale of the destruction. Hatten looked like a ghost town, streets filled with wreckage, buildings reduced to splintered wood and shattered bricks. But in the midst of this devastation, one figure remained unmoved: Staff Sergeant Vito R. Bertoldo. He had slept little, his body screaming with pain from shrapnel wounds and frostbite. Yet the moment he heard the familiar rumble of engines, every ache vanished. The Germans were back, this time with reinforced infantry and armored support. Bertoldo rose from the rubble, cleaned his weapon, and prepared to do what he had been doing for nearly 24 hours: hold the line at any cost. The first targets were infantry advancing under the cover of smoke. Bertoldo fired from his window, picking off enemy soldiers before they could reach the command post. Tracer rounds streaked across the morning sky, sparks against the falling snow. Behind him, medics and a few remaining soldiers watched in awe, realizing that this small farmhouse was the keystone of the American defensive line. Then came the tanks. 2 Panthers and a half-track moved into position, firing point-blank into houses along the street. Bertoldo switched to his secondary machine gun and aimed for the infantry riding with the tanks. Each burst forced them to duck and scatter, slowing the advance. At one point, a German tank managed to fire a round that tore through part of the roof, sending debris crashing to the floor. Bertoldo scrambled through the wreckage, reloading the Browning and targeting the enemy again. His accuracy was uncanny, each shot a calculated measure of survival and defiance. The Germans attempted a flanking maneuver, hoping to encircle the farmhouse. Bertoldo anticipated it, moving to a new firing position that covered the back alley. When the first wave came into view, he opened fire, cutting them down before they could reach the building. Each time the enemy regrouped, he met them with unrelenting fire, buying precious time for the remaining American forces. By mid-morning, the Germans began to pull back, frustrated and battered. Reports later indicated dozens of enemy casualties, many killed directly by Bertoldo's hand. His steadfast defense had not only saved the command post, but had kept the entire battalion from collapse. The few soldiers left alive in Hatten looked at him with respect and disbelief. Here was a man who had fought for nearly a full day and night against overwhelming odds, refusing to yield. His courage had inspired those around him, proving that determination could turn the tide even in the bleakest moments. Bertoldo, bruised and bloodied, allowed himself a brief moment of relief. The Germans had retreated, for now, but he knew this battle was far from over, and that the next wave would test him even further. By late afternoon, the distant roar of artillery signaled that reinforcements were on their way. American tanks and infantry from nearby units were advancing toward Hatten, a sign that relief might finally arrive. For the first time in nearly 2 full days, Staff Sergeant Vito R. Bertoldo allowed himself a flicker of hope. Yet the Germans were not finished. They had suffered heavy losses, but their determination remained unbroken. Reports later revealed that senior officers were furious. The stubborn defense of the farmhouse had disrupted the entire plan for Nordwind in this sector. Bertoldo, however, had no time to reflect on enemy frustration. Every second counted. He moved quickly through the ruined command post, checking his ammunition and repositioning his Browning machine gun. The farmhouse was barely holding together, But Bertoldo's strategy was simple: hold the enemy at bay until help arrived. He set traps with grenades along the outer walls, stacked debris to block windows, and used every ounce of his experience to fortify what remained. The Germans launched another wave, this time combining infantry with machine gun nests. Bertoldo met them with relentless fire, his calm under pressure remarkable. Each burst cut down the enemy. Each grenade thrown disrupted their advance. The snow around the farmhouse was trampled and bloodied, a stark testament to the ferocity of the fight. By late afternoon, the first reinforcements arrived, tanks rolling along the street, infantry following closely behind. Bertoldo continued to hold his position, firing into the enemy's flank. The German soldiers, now caught between fresh troops and his machine gun, were forced to retreat. His solo defense had bought the reinforcements crucial minutes, turning what could have been a catastrophic breakthrough into a manageable counterattack. Even with backup arriving, Bertoldo did not rest. He coordinated with the incoming units, directing fire, identifying weak points in the enemy line, and ensuring that the farmhouse did not fall. His presence inspired the newcomers. They were fighting not just with weapons, but with the resolve that radiated from the man who had held this position almost alone. By evening, the German offensive in the Hatten sector had been effectively halted. The farmhouse still stood, battered and blackened, but it remained in American hands. Staff Sergeant Vito Bertoldo, exhausted and wounded, finally allowed himself a moment to sit and catch his breath. The legend of the man who had defended 2 command posts almost single-handedly was already spreading. His actions had saved countless lives, maintained a critical position, and turned a desperate situation into a symbol of courage and perseverance for the entire division. The events at Hatten did not remain a secret for long. Word of the staff sergeant who had held a ruined farmhouse against repeated German assaults spread rapidly through the 42nd Infantry Division. Fellow soldiers spoke in hushed tones of the man who refused to abandon his post despite exhaustion, injury, and overwhelming odds. Yet, for Bertoldo, there had been no time for reflection or pride. Survival and duty had been all that mattered. Within days, commanding officers began compiling reports of his actions. Eyewitness accounts described in meticulous detail how Bertoldo had fought continuously for nearly 48 hours, repelling infantry and armor, repairing his weapons under fire, and preventing the Germans from breaching the American lines. These reports were supplemented by statements from medics, radio operators, and other personnel who had witnessed his unwavering courage. On February 23, 1945, General Alexander M. Patch, commander of the U.S. 7th Army, personally recommended Staff Sergeant Vito R. Bertoldo for the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration for valor. The recommendation highlighted the extraordinary impact of his actions. One man holding a critical position against superior forces, directly contributing to the successful defense of the entire sector. The official citation detailed his relentless heroism. He maintained a vital defense, despite repeated enemy attacks and personal wounds. By his extraordinary courage and selfless devotion to duty, he prevented the capture of 2 battalion command posts, inspiring all who witnessed his valor. Bertoldo received the Medal of Honor on March 27, 1945, in a ceremony attended by officers, enlisted men, and fellow veterans. For many, it was a moment of triumph not just for him, but for the spirit of the 42nd Infantry Division, embodying the resilience and determination of American soldiers across Europe. Yet, true to his character, Bertoldo remained humble. He credited the men around him, the medics who worked tirelessly under fire, the officers who coordinated defenses, and the fellow soldiers who held their positions, for their collective effort. In interviews later in life, he would describe the Medal of Honor not as a personal award, but as recognition of what a group of ordinary men could achieve when faced with extraordinary circumstances. His story became a symbol of courage under fire, and it inspired soldiers across the front. The defense of Hatten was taught in military courses, cited in after-action reports, and remembered as an example of the difference one determined individual could make in the chaos of battle. Vito Bertoldo's name was etched into the annals of World War II history, not because he sought glory, but because, when the fate of his comrades and the mission hung in the balance, he refused to yield. The defense of Hatten by Staff Sergeant Vito R. Bertoldo became more than a single act of heroism. It became a lesson in courage, leadership, and the human spirit. Historians and military analysts would later cite his actions as a prime example of how one determined individual could alter the course of a battle, even against overwhelming odds. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, the soldiers who survived the assault on the farmhouse spoke repeatedly of the morale boost that Bertoldo's defense had provided. The knowledge that someone was willing to stand his ground, to hold the line when all seemed lost, instilled confidence in his comrades. Many testified that seeing Bertoldo fire relentlessly through the night gave them the courage to face the enemy themselves. Beyond the battlefield, his actions had strategic consequences. By holding the command posts, Bertoldo delayed German advances, prevented a collapse of the battalion's defensive positions, and bought critical time for reinforcements to arrive. These minutes and hours, though small in the context of an entire front, were decisive. They prevented a breakthrough that could have led to higher casualties and potentially extended the German offensive in Alsace. The Medal of Honor that Bertoldo received was not just a personal accolade. It became a symbol of the American fighting spirit. His story was shared in newspapers, radio broadcasts, and later military histories, inspiring both soldiers and civilians. Young men training for combat studied his tactics, while officers emphasized the importance of initiative, courage, and improvisation under fire. Bertoldo's legacy extended even further. He demonstrated that leadership does not depend on rank or size of command. It depends on resolve, ingenuity, and the willingness to act decisively when others hesitate. His improvisation in fortifying the farmhouse, his skill in targeting enemy troops under extreme conditions, and his relentless endurance under fire exemplified qualities that would inform military doctrine for decades. In the decades following World War II, veterans and historians continued to recount the story of Hatten. Bertoldo's heroism remained a testament to the extraordinary capabilities of ordinary soldiers. He passed away in 1966, but the farmhouse he defended, the soldiers he saved, and the legend of his courage continued to resonate. Ultimately, the lesson of Vito R. Bertoldo is timeless. Courage under fire, determination in the face of impossible odds, and the refusal to yield can change the course of events. One man, armed with resolve, resourcefulness, and a Browning machine gun, proved that even in the darkest hours, heroism can shine, leaving a legacy that endures long after the guns have fallen silent.